everything I've seen so far to say, okay, this is how you get like a credible signal to Ethereum that people are decentralized, I think hasn't really passed the bar for how how credible we need these signals to be.
I'm looking forward, like diving a little bit into rainbow staking today and your work at the Ethereum Foundation, and then talking a little bit about decentralization and how to incentivize decentralization on a protocol level as well. So tell us a little bit, like, how did you get started working on these topics? How did you start at the Ethereum Foundation, and you're working in the robust incentives group, right? What is that? And how did you get to that role? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. I've been at the Ethereum Foundation for more than 4 years now. I finished a PhD in algorithmic game theory, systems engineering, and I basically wrote a research proposal to say, okay, this algorithmic game theory is like really helpful to understand blockchain systems. I was really getting into it towards the end of a PhD. And that proposal like grew. I got some more people at the foundation that were interested. So we started this robust incentives group. Since then, we grew. Our team is now 7 people full time, and we work on anything that touches mechanism design, protocol design, with a bit of an academic bent. So we try to write some papers and participate in conferences. That's mostly what we're up to.
And the objective of the robust incentives group, so that's the 7 people, right, in this robust incentives group. And
Yes.
then the objective is to research Ethereum incentives and kind of monetary policy, basically. Or
Right. Yeah, we do a bit of monetary policy, and it's one of the big discussions that's happening at the moment. I wouldn't say it's our core focus, like it's one of the facets of Ethereum, of course. Maybe like a succinct description of the team would be like we're constantly trying to red team the incentives of Ethereum, like trying to find like the gaps and the flaws that might exist. So yeah, we've had a couple of these. So I was looking at the IP 1559. That one was pretty tight, so it went in. Our team at some point was involved with reorgs and potential for them. So that's something that we looked into and helped fix. Timing games were also very interesting and important for staking providers. So that's something that actually the name timing games is coming actually from our team. I think we've been ahead of like many of the big problems that Ethereum might face, and we are trying to communicate about them and understand them better.
and then recently there's been a big discussion around reducing the issuance for Ethereum as well. So that also like came from your team, right? The research around that.
Some people in my team were involved on that topic for a while. Like Anders has been thinking about it for more than 2 years. There's been other people at the foundation and outside even who have been feeling like, okay, we're trending towards like an equilibrium that might not be desirable with liquid staking, with restaking. Not that any of these things are undesirable, but the way we deal with them at protocol level might need to be different. And so, yeah, so people in my team, and I've helped with that, have put forward proposals or research papers or posts to try and explain the reasons why we might want to consider a change. And by we, I mean like the Ethereum community as a whole. And I think it was published in the hope that it would start conversation, and that it has definitely did. But it is going to be like a pretty long conversation to have, and because yeah, it's so fundamental to Ethereum, to the way the system is designed, that we really want to make sure that everything is super tight and that we have broad agreement on how to move forward with that. Yeah.
And then is the change in the issuance for Ethereum, it's also related to the rainbow staking that you've been working on, right? So maybe you can tell a little bit of like how did you get to like research the rainbow staking as well, and what does it have to do with the change of the issuance as well?
Yeah, to some extent it's true. So while these people in my team were working on issuance, I was myself a bit more interested in what I call the microeconomics of staking. So like the mechanisms of staking. So what does the staking experience look like? Is it you're a validator? Do you delegate? So there's like a very wide set of designs that exist in practice and in theory. So what really wanted to focus on was, okay, how do we make staking good? And that is true at any scale, let's say, of the issuance. The issuance can be very plentiful or very scarce. Either ways, like you'd have to figure out what does it look like in your protocol for the staker to come and to perform validation duties for the protocol. And so that was really my focus. And while thinking through this, I started feeling like, okay, regardless of the issuance and regardless of these questions, like if we have like a very strong set of staking mechanism that promote decentralization, that promote robustness, at least we can feel a bit more confident about where we are going. So if we feel like, okay, reducing issuance is probably never like good news because it kind of means less money, though we feel like there are arguments for getting there. But yeah, so different branches that do have an overlap, but I would say the work of Rainbow Staking is trying to make the staking experience as healthy as possible under any kind of macro conditions.
And obviously, like I think one of the things on the issuance change would mean reducing the issuance for everyone equally, all participants. And I think the interesting idea you brought forward with rainbow staking is introducing different type of participants, right? Maybe you can just guide us a little bit through what is rainbow staking exactly and how can it make staking better on Ethereum?
Mhm. I see rainbow staking as not like a specific proposal of, okay, these are like the steps that should be activated in the protocol, but more as a way of rethinking our approach to mechanisms and to what I call protocol services. So what I observe as a protocol designer is the community is trying to tack on more and more service that the validators need to fill. So currently on Ethereum, like when you sign up to become a validator, you're asked to vote, so to finalize like blocks that make them like really impossible to revert or economically very expensive to revert. So that's one thing. There's another role which is called the sync committee, where you kind of attest to like the head of the chain as you see it. You have, of course, the role of producing the block, so like the execution payload that contains the transaction. And we've seen with PBS that validators now don't do that themselves, like they tend to delegate that function to builders. There's more roles that are being considered for the future, like inclusion list for censorship resistance, hardening PBS with ePBS or with execution tickets. And so just like considering that holistically, what it led me to wonder is we want like all of these services from the protocol. So that's the one side, let's say the demand for things. And on the other side, like we have the people who are going to fulfill these services. So the services are abstract, but the people are actually like machines, so hardware and software node operators. And so if we have like just a single entry point into becoming a protocol service provider that is supposed to kind of do like everything at the same time, we might essentially optimize for the most sophisticated participant because we are saying, okay, you have to do everything to be able to be a good service provider. And so what you observe is then people who are not good at doing everything, they're going to delegate. And with delegation come principal agent problems of incentive alignment between all the parties. And so the sort of approach of rainbow staking is saying, well, why not just like take a step back, look at everything we ask for out of our protocol, and then try to see if we can cleverly architect the different services and have almost like different entry points to becoming a service provider for each one of them. And with that, perhaps we get good mileage and more decentralization of these operator layers.
Yeah, so it's basically like splitting up the different types of work that the protocol requires into different types, or like kind of abstracting them, heavy services and light services.
Mhm.
And I wonder like if there's different incentives for like heavy services and light service. That's the idea, right? To have like different incentive pools. So there's a certain amount of ETH issuance going to light services, a certain amount of ETH issuance going to heavy services. How can you like still incentivize light services if you also offer like, because the idea is also to offer delegation into the system, right? So you can delegate to heavy services or light services. But for me, as imagine I'm a Ethereum staker, like why should I operate a light service, which maybe is super easy to do? I can do it. Maybe I run a validator on my phone.
Mhm.
I'm not sure. Maybe you can also shed some light if that's the vision. But like, why should I run a validator on my phone instead of just delegating my tokens to a heavy service? Maybe I will earn more money there, isn't it? Or
Many questions there, but yeah, that's essentially correct. So I would say the distinction between heavy and light services comes from the fundamental requirement that are demanded of you as a service provider for each one of them. So how I define heavy services is not really so much even about sophistication. Like you can run today like an Ethereum full node or a staking node with fairly light hardware, not really with a phone yet, though that's something that people hope will happen in the future. So it's not really like the difference between heavy and light is about, okay, you need like good hardware for heavy and not so good hardware for light. It's more like for heavy services, they're defined by the requirement for stake, so for capital, to make a credible commitment about a service that you provide. And when there is this capital requirement, like this idea of, okay, you have to put some money behind your words or behind the messages that you sign, what we observe is that you have a natural process of some people want to be capital providers without being operators. Some people want to be operators without being capital providers. And the way it happens specifically for staking, so staking when there is a slashing risk, is long chains of people delegating to a protocol that then delegates to node operator that then stakes into the protocol. So what you observe, like from the primary requirement of having economic security backing your service, is these long lines of delegations, which we know as liquid staking protocols like LSPs or other centralized providers. And so that is really fundamental. It's not something we can go around. So Ethereum has slashing so that we can make this claim of economic security. And as long as it's there, this heavy service is going to, in my opinion, lead to people trying to free their capital from being stuck at stake in Ethereum. And so that kind of incentive, to me, is always going to lead to this delegator and operator distinction. So that's for the heavy service part. Maybe I can just say like briefly about the light service. So the idea there is you can provide these services without making that economic claim behind you. So it's more about we need to find the people, like out of a set of operators, we need to find those that will do a good service. And the way to find those, you can actually think of it almost as like token curation. So you have like people out there who have ETH, who want a network that's more decentralized, less or more censorship resistant. And so you're going to task them with figuring out which of these potential operators like do the best job at surfacing these properties. And so now it's not really so much these operators need to put stake behind their claims, because these are services that are additive. So that's a bit more technical, but it's really just about having a signal that tells us who are the people that do a good job of surfacing the signal of censorship resistance to the protocol. And so these light services are more about leader selection. So finding ways to give more weight to people who do a good job. And then with the claim that these services of, for instance, censorship resistance might be pretty light to run. So you don't need like complicated machines, you don't need economic security. And so you don't necessarily have like super long lines of intermediation between the operator and the delegator in the light service stack.
But could it also be then that it turns out for like the big staking providers then to also operate these light services, isn't it?
Yes.
Because then like what prevents them to also do the light services? Because technically they can do everything. So how can we get kind of the home stakers to do the light services, I would say, or like the people running from their phone? And then that's the goal, right? We want the institutional staking providers to the heavy services and the others the light services. But couldn't the big companies also do the light services, or it also gets centralized there?
It's a good question. So nothing prevents people who are doing the heavy service from also doing the light service. But the claim that I make in this rainbow staking post, and which might turn out to be like, yeah, over promising or not exactly correct. But the claim I make is that if we're able to make the heavy services and the light services as orthogonal as possible from one another, so with the least amount of synergies between them, and if we're able to make the light services friendly to social inputs, my claim is that we can essentially give an unfair advantage to solo staker or to community takers in the provision of these light services. So maybe at this point it's good to give an example of like what exactly is this light service. And that relates to a proposal that's discussed at the moment called inclusion list. So the idea that when you have this delegation of a validator getting their blocks made by someone else, like a builder, the builder might have preferences over what to include in the block that are different from what the validator would prefer. So the validator set in Ethereum is pretty decentralized. The builder set by construction, not so much. And so when you give the construction of the block duties to the builder, you're kind of losing this nice property, which is that when you have a very decentralized set of participants, like their preference is very broad. And so they're going to include kind of anyone. So the censorship resistance will be pretty high. And so the idea of this inclusion list is to say, okay, now there's this class of participants who are building blocks for the protocol, builders, and they're not really constrained by anything. And so what if we had a way of surfacing in protocol this input that there are transactions out there that exist, that are signed, that are fee paying, that are ready to be executed. And so you as a builder, you don't have a legitimate reason to not include them in your block because they are like you have this idea of neutrality. Any transaction that's signed and pays the fees should get in. And so if we can force you, like if we can enforce the contents of this list to appear in your block, like we're going to improve censorship resistance. And so currently, the way we think about this list is, well, validators have delegated to builders the role of building the block. So the validators could be making these lists and saying, okay, make the block on my behalf. But by the way, you also have to include these things that I know about and that maybe you preferred not to deal with. And so now in the rainbow staking framework, what I claim is that the construction of this list can actually be done by not just the validators who are staking and doing the finality gadget, but could be done like by a separate set of participants who is able to surface this input in a way that is legible to the protocol. And so, for instance, if I had the choice as an ETH holder to say, okay, Coinbase is offering to prepare these lists, or some community member that I appreciate is also prepared to do this, I might decide, I trust Coinbase with my money when it comes to staking and there's the risks, etc. But I trust this guy who's like a well-respected community member to provide this censorship resistant service better than Coinbase. And so if we find like this class of light services that, gives an unfair advantage to the social layer, let's say, I think we can actually get the most out of our buck and not enshrine some kind of social layer into the protocol, but allow service providers who have like a high signal of credibility to participate effectively in these light services.
So the preparation of the inclusion lists could be done by someone else, like by the light services, for example.
Correct.
But then wouldn't it force the big providers then to like include transactions that they don't want to include? So if there's an OFAC censored transaction on the inclusion list, then this might force like a big staking provider to include it, right?
Yeah, so there are always like questions on this. I detail in the post the approaches. So you can think of it as almost like there's two camps, the staking providers and the light services. You could make it such that, so I call that strong coupling. If the heavy layer like just ignores the lists that are made by the light layer, like you could essentially write in protocol that the full nodes just have to halt and they say, okay, there's something going on wrong. We see the light services like producing this list. We see the heavy providers like kind of disregarding them. And so we halt. That would be a way to make a very like credible threat to, okay, you have to kind of work with this list because otherwise we'll just like stop following the chain. But you could also make it weak. So a weaker coupling where you say, we would prefer you like to include this list, but we're not going to like halt if you don't. And in a way, when you do this, it's kind of the status quo of what it would be today if the staking providers were responsible for making the list themselves. So the staking providers could, in a no heavy and light service separation, could always decide to not make a list and just keep doing what they're doing. So what I'm claiming with rainbow staking is that having this weak coupling only improves our options in terms of getting this input into the protocol. Like if the heavy staking providers anyways don't want to hear about it, they are not going to want to hear about it in rainbow staking or in the current status quo. But at least having the ability to create these lists and the potential ability to incentivize heavy staking providers to enforce these lists, like there are also some ideas around that in the post. I think we can create a bit more resilience and a bit more economic pressure for people to fall in line with respect to that.
Cool. So I would love to dive a little bit more into like the delegation idea for Ethereum, because obviously, like, contrary to the rest of the proof of stake space, Ethereum has made a conscious choice to not have any in protocol native delegation basically on the chain. I think it's also like one of the reasons why Ethereum is one of the most decentralized proof of stake chains. So it really kind of forces a lot of people to run validators almost. And I understand now there's like more liquid staking protocols coming up. So maybe the idea is a little bit weakened. Is that the idea why now is like the time to come up with delegation? Or like, what do you think? Is like, with your proposal, would Ethereum essentially become a delegated proof of stake chain as well? And what is your take on kind of the conscious decision to not have delegation from the beginning and now kind of changing that?
Yeah, these are good questions. And I joined the foundation in January 2020. not just the foundation, but I started ramping up in Ethereum like around the same time. And I was observing all these conversations that were, so the Beacon chain that started like proof of stake, that was before the merge, but the start of the proof of stake chain was December 2020, so like a year after. And so at the time, there was a lot of conversation of like, okay, what should go in there? I think there was some resistance about having delegated proof of stake enshrined at protocol level, because there was a sense that okay, this drives like a lot of power law sort of distribution of you have like a few stakers that are well known and everybody delegates to them. This is like really me talking, and there might be like different perspective on this, but I feel like there was also the idea that we're running like this different consensus protocol with aggregated signature. We can scale that to like a lot of participants, even if again one validator is not necessarily like one entity. Like it can be very mixed. But there was a sense that let's just see what happens like if we do like the minimal unit of validation, which is like the smallest validator size we can, and let the market kind of figure out what shape should it take like on a layer above the protocol. Around the same time, there was also like more and more talk about liquid staking. I don't think there was anything in production yet, but I do remember like reading some papers from Chorus One and from some researchers about it. But it was a bit like also difficult, in my opinion, to like project into the future and understand, okay, what are the effects of this? Like, how does this affect the design of the protocol? Especially at a time where there was so many other questions to answer on, like, how do you even like run this thing? Like all the incentives. It was again like a different consensus mechanism than anything that existed out there. So there were also questions on this. It almost feels like a bit of a protocol design capacity question. I think I'm not like the first one to say that maybe we should rethink like this idea of delegation in Ethereum. Like rainbow staking builds on the work of many people at the foundation and outside. There was Donkrad, Ericsson had a post on Entride LSTs that was very interesting. Vitalik kind of brought that topic up again, Mike Neuder. So there were like already discussions on, okay, should we reconsider like this idea of delegation on the basis of what we've empirically observed on the network and also outside, like other proof of stake chains that have launched since. But again, like there is a desire to, I think, do it the Ethereum way. So what is applicable to Ethereum in our context, which is so different from other proof of stake chains. And so rainbow staking, I think, was my attempt at saying, okay, there's like all these different threads that seem to connect to like one big picture. Maybe this is that, and maybe this is like a way of thinking about it, and a way that is modular as well. So we don't have to like go the full rainbow staking approach, but maybe it gives us like some perspectives of, okay, we can incrementally improve that part of like the heavy layer, and maybe we never need to have a light layer at all, and we do things differently. But at least I wanted to like blow the frame out and just say, okay, what's out there and what can we think about?
Yeah. Do you think it was a mistake for Ethereum to not offer in protocol delegation from the start?
I don't think it was a mistake. I think it was an experiment, but I don't think it turned out that bad. I mean, it did like, I think the argument is you have such big pools anyway, like Lido, that are built on top of proof of stake networks. I find that the distribution across, let's say, validating entities is not so different. And for instance, Lido itself is pretty internally decentralized. So there's like 35 node operators that are responsible for the stake that Lido has. So I think it didn't turn out too badly. It did like give some useful empirical evidence of what are the centralizing pressures that we might observe in this like absolute free market environment, and what are the mechanisms that might make sense to have so that like we're comfortable with the staking experience moving forward.
Yeah, I think one of the great things about the Ethereum community is obviously everyone really cares about decentralization and everyone wants Ethereum to be decentralized. And I think that also leads to quite a bit of like social pressure on the industry to like to decentralize, to develop different clients and to run your own validator and so on. But I wonder if that's like a long-term viable solution. I think ultimately there need to be some like in protocol incentives for decentralization. What are your thoughts on this? So far, I've mainly seen, I think, disincentives for centralization, but I haven't really seen any incentives for decentralization. And I wonder if you have looked into that topic already and what you think about it. Is that possible that we can kind of pay more to the parties that really support the resilience and decentralization of the network?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's something that comes up I would say all the time. You're right that there's two approaches to this. Like there's the stick and the carrot. We have a lot of sticks in the protocol, which are called like anti-correlation penalties. So we try to make it such that your reward scale roughly, or like your penalty scale roughly as well as other people are doing badly. So if we know that you're like in cahoots with someone else, like we're going to maybe hit you with the stick a bit harder. Vitalik has a new post actually on ETH research advising to even like make that stronger. But from the carrot perspective,
That's basically when someone gets slashed under the same conditions, then the slashing will be heavier. So
yeah,
it disincentivizes like large providers to run like the same setup.
to keep the staking key controlling like the same staking key controlling like many different validators or a big amount of stake. Yeah. And so yeah, so then the carrot approach is a bit harder. Like when you say you want to reward decentralization, I think first you have to measure it in a way that's kind of credible and measure it in good conditions. So not just when there's like a fault. And there are principles, of course, on Ethereum of you have neutrality. The protocol should be pretty light because you don't want to tinker with it like all the time. Ethereum like wants to ossify, like be at a point where okay, we're like hands off on the mechanisms that are in there. So to find like this mechanism that's legible over time, or this signal of decentralization that's legible over time, that's pretty hard. One approach that I'm kind of giving in the rainbow staking post is saying, well, censorship resistance might actually be like a good signal. So let's say you surface a lot of transactions that other people are not willing to like surface to the protocol. You can actually measure that. So you can measure the difference between the signal that I provide in terms of what should get in and the signal that other people are providing. And if you just like take the difference between the signal, you can tell, okay, you can reward essentially people for being like a better information feeder into the protocol. So I think that's like a very promising approach. And then I also feel like externally, so without us needing like to necessarily do something about it, there are incentives to be decentralized. So when Lido, for instance, runs like these 35 node operators at the back, they do that not because they are trying to. It's expensive, is what I mean. Like to have so many people like running your protocol, it's much easier like to have an integrated thing. But I think they do that because they want to make like a credible commitment or a credible signal to say, okay, we're like internally resilient. Like there's a lot of strengths, like nobody can really take over the thing. And that credible signal of decentralization is valuable to them as a product. I think it makes it that people might hold an LST that is really decentralized, like Rocket Pool or Lido. So all of these protocols that have like all these mechanisms to kind of constrain the node operators, you might feel a bit more comfortable holding it than an LST that is issued by a single provider that might have like a lot more points of control over your assets. So even at that layer, I find that it's not, of course, like the net effect is unclear. It's always better to be more capital efficient and to just run your operations in a vertically integrated way. But there is also a premium to using services that are more decentralized at the back. And yeah, I think there's a claim to be made that the protocol might not need to be doing more than that to stay decentralized. And yeah, hopefully we're always in an economic environment where this decentralization premium is something that's worth it to the users. And if it doesn't become worth it to the user at any point of time, I don't think they have much use for a blockchain like Ethereum anyways. So it's a bit of my pessimistic argument, but I also think we can do better.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it's one of the biggest value propositions of a blockchain or of Ethereum to be very decentralized as well. And I guess the question is also like how much, or like it's very hard to measure decentralization. Like you said, there's no metrics, and it's hard to say, okay, now the chain is decentralized, now it's centralized. It's a spectrum. And I wonder, like, in terms of like bringing more data or metrics around decentralization, it's obviously not just going to be one decentralization metric, but for example, something like geographic distribution or something. Is that something that could kind of be fed or like oracled to the chain, or to what extent could that be possible? Yeah, to incentivize geographic distribution, if like, and because we need to feed it somehow this information on chain. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this is so for any kind of like decentralization metric that we might care about, I think the question is, can you feed that credibly and legibly into the protocol? Geographic decentralization obviously is like great. Is that easy to have a credible signal for it? it's actually, I think, really hard. So for instance, I could be telling you that I run a node somewhere, and I could even like place one of my node, let's say like a relay node somewhere that makes you think I'm very decentralized, but actually all of my operations are run from like a single jurisdiction, and I'm only like doing the last hop to the protocol with another node. If you measure the time it takes for messages to go across, people are going to gain that. Like people are going to make their network topology work in a way to kind of fool your oracle. So then what you did is, okay, if you have like trusted maybe oracles, like a set of nodes that people are saying, these are people we trust, they are running these oracles, maybe we can feed that into the protocol. I find that is just not really the way of doing things in Ethereum. Like people tend to be a bit more hesitant in adding like too much of these non-credible signals into the protocol, and sort of pegging the rewards and the mechanisms of the protocol on that. I think it doesn't mean that it cannot exist. Again, I think from like a social layer perspective, but even like from a economic layer perspective, it makes sense for a product that sells LSTs to claim that they are very geographically decentralized, and even to claim credibly that they are. But I just find that, yeah, everything I've seen so far to say, okay, this is how you get like a credible signal to Ethereum that people are decentralized, I think hasn't really passed the bar for how credible we need these signals to be.
Do you think it could be like some sort of like social consensus, like similar to like a social recovery wallet, and then like someone signals, like some of the validators running light services, they signal if another light service or like another validator is in a certain jurisdiction or is more or less decentralized?
Yeah, in theory, it's possible, of course, and I think I don't have like examples, but I do feel like proof of location and stuff like this like has been explored in some chains, and I think it does rely on like this idea of surfacing things. The light layer might be, yeah, a way of saying, okay, you have this social input that I was discussing earlier that can be surfaced in a legible way. I would expect, however, people to be quite selective about what are the light services that are protocol intelligible. To me, censorship resistance, like this inclusion list, fits the bill because it's something that the protocol kind of is trying to offer as a service, and something that the community feels also strongly about, and something that I think can be offered in a pretty credible way. Would that be extended to other things? Even if it's technically possible, again, to say, I will stake on or give weight to this light service provider who I believe is reporting truthfully about the state of decentralization, I think people might find that this opens the door to capture or to undue incentives that are starting to contaminate the network itself. So I'm a bit bearish on this, but maybe there's something there that I'm also missing, and progress so can always happen.
Yeah, we'll see. What are your thoughts on other proof of stake chains, or like the incentives of other proof of stake chains? Is there anything that sticks out to you, or anything that you find particularly noteworthy, or like, for example, Ethereum can or should learn from?
Yeah, I've actually mentioned like in the rainbow staking post, the liquid staking module from Cosmos, which I think is a good like way of thinking about LSPs. Like it's hard to enshrine like a liquid staking protocol in protocol because of this curation of a node operator set. So I think like it will not be the Ethereum protocol won't get there. But you could enshrine like this middle ground of saying, okay, you have protocol objects which are legible to the protocol. So like these shares of delegation that people have. And then the liquid staking protocols, they're kind of built on top of that layer. And their role is to curate like a good basket of shares, or a good basket of node operators. That gives to me like the appropriate level of control and the appropriate level of legibility from the protocol. So I think that's nice. We had also been looking at other designs. Tezos had some interesting ideas around CTES, so you could collateralize like a position and essentially issue a stable-ish asset out of this position. So yeah, there are like different ideas out there that I think are relevant and that we're kind of looking at.
What do you think on the kind of native liquid staking, similar like in Tezos and Cardano? Like there's no lockup for delegators. There's only a lockup for the validators. And there's also no slashing for the delegators. There's only slashing for the validators. Again, if you compare that with, for example, Cosmos, where like everyone is slashable and everyone has a lockup, what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that's actually something that we are investigating more precisely. So there was some thoughts in Ethereum about penalties capping. So what if like you had the possibility of capping the penalties to only the operator part? Some of that train of thought is also what led to rainbow staking. So I talk a bit about that in the post. Yeah, I think there are ideas that are interesting there, but to me it seems like it might not really change like the fundamental problem. So even if you only make the operator stake slashable, it doesn't mean that the operator stake is just people who are actually putting their own money on the line. Like it can still mean that me as a person who's looking for yield, I'm going to give my stake to the operator, and now the operator will just again like delegate, or it will look like an operator delegator separation internally. So that's a criticism I see with that. Another thing that I've been thinking about, I don't claim to have like expert knowledge on Tezos or Cardano, but I do feel when you have like this, so liquid staking in this context don't I think mean the same thing as liquid staking when we look at Lido, for instance. It's more liquid in the sense that when I delegate to like a given operator that I choose, I get this asset out of it, so this representation of it. But to me, that asset is the fungibility of this asset with other, let's say, outstanding Tezos or ADA is a bit complicated by the fact that the asset represents a delegation to like a specific operator. And so I know there are mechanisms that kind of recreate this fungibility, but it's very different to me from liquid staking in like, let's say, Lido, where it's more about I give my asset to like this protocol that then goes and splits that equally between different node operators. And I don't have control over like where my asset goes. Like it socializes the rewards and the losses. I feel like there are many different designs. I'm still like trying to learn more about many of them, but I do find that sometimes the words mean different things or the same things are called with different words, which makes it like not so easy to figure out always.
I mean, the difference is like in Tezos, you don't get a liquid staking token or something. It's just never locked up, so you can freely move it and deploy it in DeFi or anywhere else. And then I think these DeFi protocols are then required to always set an operator for the deployed capital and so on. So
Yeah.
yeah, it's just a very different dynamic, I guess, to what we see in Ethereum or Cosmos liquid staking. Yeah, I mean, this is really exciting. It's a great conversation, I think, and I really appreciate also you bringing the rainbow staking on the map. I think it's something that makes a lot of sense. Just in terms of the mindset to like, yeah, let's rethink the incentives and the different participants and how we can ultimately incentivize decentralization and different participants and a resilient network while being very close to the actual like dynamics of the market. I think yeah, we just have to move with what the market wants and needs to make Ethereum secure, decentralized, and scalable. Yeah, perfect. Like, how can people get involved, or like, do you have any ways, like, if someone has comments or like would like to get involved in the research or anything, what would be ways to contribute?
Yep. I mean, we're definitely like in the early stages of this conversation. Like it's not even a proposal at this point because I'm not claiming there's a specific thing that we should be doing. So I've posted that on ETH Research, which is the Ethereum Community Research Forum. There is a comment box where you can leave like long form comments. I already had like some discussions with a few people in there to try and give maybe like incremental approach to getting these ideas to like a more concrete stage. So yeah, feel free to reply here. I'm available on anyone's favorite social network and always happy to chat about this.
Cool, perfect. Then thanks for being on the show and looking forward to the next few months and seeing these ideas evolving.